I'm Yvette Benavides, and this is The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner on Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Today's story, the third in our series celebrating the stories of Gina Berriault, is Works of the Imagination. Protagonist Thomas Lang is a novelist who's holed up in a hotel in the Bernese Alps to write his memoirs, but the words won't come. A disquietude troubles his mind. He's getting older. The all-consuming idea of facing his mortality distracts him from his writing and even, it seems, from the curiosity and compassion that used to guide his work. In his essay, Under All This Noise, from the book Am I Alone Here?, Peter Orner contemplates becoming a reclusive writer. He says there's, quote, something seductive about these mysterious figures who squirrel away, and that we can imagine them toiling in a remote mountain cabin. Orner's yearning to vanish is rooted in his uneasy relationship with how theoretically connected we all are with one another now, particularly through the soul-crushing proclivity of oversharing on social media. Inventing characters, writes Orner, non-existent people, and introducing them in an already overcrowded, indifferent world is an act of faith. When Orner happens upon a book of poetry by Herbert Morris called What Was Lost, he finds that it's completely bereft of biographical information. No author photo, no bio, no acknowledgments, only the poems. Orner settles on the one titled History, Weather, Loss, the Children, Georgia, where Morris writes about a photo of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt sitting in their car in front of a group of school children who are about to serenade them. Franklin does not touch his wife in that tender moment captured just before the young children break into song, their mouths forever in little O's, but also Eleanor untouched by her husband for an eternity. Orner surmises that Franklin's failure makes the poem, quote, an elegy for this touch that never happened. Readers, Orner reminds us, want people in their most intimate, unguarded moments, like Franklin, who Morris said committed a crucial failure in not meeting his wife's vulnerability, sitting there in the back of that open car. We see Thomas Lang in many unguarded moments in Works of the Imagination, including the moment when he's awakened by his heart, by his fear that he is dying, and waits for the feeling to pass with his hand on his chest. This story has a photograph too. The reclusive Thomas Lang moves his stare from his empty notebook to the framed images on the wall of those who climbed the mountain outside his window and didn't make it back down. The images are like the stories that don't get written, silenced by the indifference of others, or worse, our own indifference, the indifference that would make us walk past a photo and never wonder about the inner lives of those smiling back at us, the indifference of not filling a notebook, even though we have stories to share. Books pursue us, says Orner. He found Herbert Morris's book at Dog-Eared Books on Valencia Street in San Francisco and wonders what made him stop in that day and dig that book out of a bin. And, asks Orner, how many others might be out there somewhere under all this noise, telling us things we need to hear. Gina Berriault answers that question and herself shows through her stories the crucial value of seeing and hearing people, especially those who are unsuccessful and unfortunate, to look beyond the one-dimensionality of a photo or the words on a page and feel Thomas Lang's quickening heartbeat as if it were our own. Just as Orner found Herbert Morris's book that day on Valencia Street, he believes that people who need Berriault find her in those same sorts of acts of faith Orner cleaves to and champions vociferously in quiet acts of reading and writing stories, his own brand of social media, And what happens to Thomas Lang? Listen to this. Welcome to The Lonely Voice on Book Public with Peter Orner. Here's our discussion of Works of the Imagination by Gina Berriault. Works of the Imagination. A little difficult to summarize because it's just about this guy who's going to a place to do some writing.
It's like a trope, of a kind of story about a writer who can't write. We've probably read many of these. I've written some of these. It's a good trick. Like the writer who can't write, but suddenly he writes because it's about a writer who can't write. I think it's almost a cheesy writer trope on the surface. He's traveling back to places that he lived and had important times with people who are now out of his life, and he's hoping that that's going to jumpstart his memoirs because he's reached a certain age that he's going to tell his memoirs.
Yeah, and he's been there before. It almost feels like he's trying to recapture something from 12 years ago.
Yeah, and don't we do that?
Mm-hmm.
We go back to a place thinking it's going to mean something, and somehow we it's almost like making a metaphor out of a real place. I don't know if that ever really works. It doesn't work for this guy.
Well, he has this dual perspective from 12 years ago and from now, where he says, kind of at the beginning, and of course the landscape, it's all over the place. Just look out a window and there's something to stare at. The mountains had impressed him back then as a phenomenon on display, but now he was shocked by their immensity, hypnotized by their beauty and crystal silence. Now, even the mountains have changed for him 12 years later.
Right. I believe he's in the Austrian Alps. He goes up to Kleinscheidegg, to an old hotel, again, to rekindle something in his imagination that's supposedly going to lead to writing, which, frankly, bores me, that idea. I don't want to, read about a writer trying to write, even though, again, I have committed this same crime on the page.
Well, but the thing about it is, isn't it for a writer endlessly interesting also to know that you're not alone and somebody else has written about this or experienced it, and also just to see, well, and what happens to that guy? I don't know. For me, I love stories about writers and writing, and there's something for me there so I enter the story a little bit differently. But I also understand the whole idea of how impossible it is to recapture the past and think that you can make it all some kind of deja vu and walk through it as if you're 12 years younger and have all these fresh ideas that you're going to write about.
For me, watching a writer on the page not being able to write is like watching a car accident. I am mesmerized by it, no question about it, but I'm also torn apart too, because this happens every day. I guess what my point is, what draws me to the story, and I should say, you suggested this one. I have such affection for other Berriault stories. I've read this story in the past, and it never really made an impact. And then you encouraging me to reread it, it completely, I had a different take on it, which again proves that the idea that, it's when you read a story and it's how you read it. But this story struck me as not being what it's about, or not being what it's about on the surface. It's not about a guy who's got writer's block.
I think it's right on. I wouldn't want to read a story about writer's block. And, then there's this whole question, is there such a thing as writer's block? Some writers say no, some writers say yes, but that's not what the story is about. But he is going to try to recapture something from the past. And we learn that he is, it said he had not often assisted himself that way, hanging on to the rail of the stairs. He was an erect, lean, and healthy 60. Why then was his hand on the banister? ?
Isn't that great? So he's walking up the stairs, and he's using the banister to help him, even though he doesn't need to. Now, how many times have you done that?
Mm-hmm.
I think I did it this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Like where I lean on the banister with such great false weariness, and I'm like, it's a wonderful detail, and I think it's the moment in the story on this reread that I was like, oh right, this is not what it is. This is not just a kind of a once famous writer writing his memoirs, and again, I don't think that's per se bad. I just think it's like it's been done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think here. There's more at stake, and for some reason it's in that gesture when he's sort of not needing the banister, because in reality I think he does need it psychically.
Yeah.
There's something going on with this guy.
Because that whole part about leaning against the rail is sandwiched between looking at the mountains and their crystal silence, but then it says cowbells and voices rang in the silence with an entrancingly pure pitch, and the density of the stone was silence in another guise. And then the paragraph after his leaning on the rail is the silence in the room was like an invasion, a procession of the great silent mountains. So like last time we talked about Berriault's use of the word beauty and wisdom, like these words. So, and then here we have silence all over the place.
Yeah, silence all over the place, and yet noise within that silence. I mean, it's not totally. It's like silence has a kind of another connotation other than noiselessness. It almost has this sort of weight on him. And describing silence as an invasion. That's a different kind of silence than we might be associating the word with normally.
But I like that because I feel, in the before times when we could travel and go to a hotel, it's noisy. It's noisy with like unexpected sounds. It's an unusual sensation. I feel like I have when I'm sort of in a new space and out of my comfort zone, that I feel like Berriault just captures here. And of course, there is something else going on. It's like there's an invasion of silence because he's not into it. He's not into the majesty of the mountains and this beautiful space he's in of this old hotel. He's in his own head.
And that's because, for I think at least two reasons. One is last time he was here with a lover, a friend, and the friend's wife. He was there because they were filming a movie of one of his novels that didn't take place in the Austrian Alps, but they made it take place there. There's an allusion to the Alps in the novel, but there wasn't like a scene. But then the movie makers made a scene, and so then he's like, "Cool, let's travel out there and let's go see this." So he was like 12 years ago. He was living in some other, higher on the hog or in some other kind of psychic space. He was like the big guy, And now he's, 12 years later, he has returned. He's alone. And so, yeah, everything's going to weigh real heavily, which again is all fairly not commonplace, but things that we can absolutely understand. We've gone back to places where we were with other people, and now we're back in that place alone. And she describes it so well, but I wouldn't call it disunique either, right? Mm-hmm. I think something else, like this story sort of, it's very, like a lot of Berriault, it's one thing, and then it suddenly, or not suddenly, but gradually suddenly, if that's a term of art, like it feels, because it's so short. How long is this one? 8 pages, 7 pages? Mm-hmm. It starts to gradually become something else. And I mean, I read this as a kind of horror story. Writer's block is kind of horror, is sort of a horror notion in itself, but the ante keeps getting upped.
We always talk about Berriault's genius for compression and what she's able to, what she manages on just this one page where we learn about this dual perspective, 12 years ago this, 12 years later the other. And then all of a sudden, once in the night he was wakened by his heart. His heart always wakened him in time for him to witness his own dying. And he waited now with his hand over his chest. That's the next thing after this whole section about making the movie 12 years ago, boom, here's the next thing for us to think about.
Which gets us into what I think the story is about without being very direct. But, it is almost terror, not of his own death, but I think of but being present for his own death. Like, I don't think dying is bothering this guy. I think he has a little bit of a death wish in a way. But he thinks that waking up in the night with his heart is like him. He's going to be awake for it. He's not going to die in his sleep. And that is starting to terrify him. And I think that is superseding any concerns that he has a publishing deadline.
Mm-hmm.
And he's only 60 and he's healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not rational, but there's something going on with this guy that's starting to slip. And I think that's one of the primary clues when he says that he always wakes up in time for his own heart attack, basically, is how I read that.
But the next thing he does is take out his pen. He's like, oh, I'm alive.
Right.
So the fear subsided. He took his notebook from the bedside table and fumbled to uncap his pen. He looks at the mountains, and suddenly it says, his hand was given no reason to write. His hand was given no reason to write.
To my mind, that this isn't a story about writing. He thinks it. The character thinks it's a story about writing. He thinks he's in a story about writing. If only he could get the pen started and tell us about that, experience when they were making the movie or whatever, when he met this, I think that the genius of the story is that it can easily be read that way as, oh, this writer's having a lot of trouble. He's trying to get those words out, and he almost, he thinks he's having a heart attack, and therefore then he starts to write, oh, no words are coming,
But also, was this another place he would leave his notebook empty? Because that's what it's been like all spring into the summer. He had found no place where he could begin his memoir. So it's been going on for a while.
Can I go back to the beginning to something that struck me on this read as being weird and relates to that a little bit? What I would say is there's certain details in this story that sort of send you in the wrong direction, I think, in part. Like as if it is sort of this, and then at the end, what happens? He starts to write, as if that's the story. And I there's something, again, I don't even necessarily know what it is, but in the second paragraph, there's this strange line. I'll just read from the top of the second paragraph. Lang arrived in Grindelwald in the evening, coming from Bern, where, and this is where it gets weird, where, contrary to his intention to call on a friend from the States and tell him about the insoluble task his memoirs had become, he had stayed only half a day and called on no one. So to me, it's an odd sentence. Like, who cares, like, what happened in the other place he stopped where he was going to see a friend to tell him what I would see as the fairly boring story about how he can't write his memoirs. I think she's capturing his sense of what this story is, like, which is, he's traveling in order to jumpstart his memoirs.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think then the story kind of undercuts that by not being quite about that and starts to get quite scary. He's starting to see things that aren't there, and what he's seeing is frightening to him. And that seems to go far beyond his art and his profession.
Yeah, thanks for taking us back to the beginning, because now I'm reading again what happens just after that. It was a national holiday there, and there were fireworks, and he sees this figure twice as tall as himself walking toward him, except it's not what he thinks it is. It's a little girl.
It's a little girl carrying a torch in the woods. A wonderful image. Someone approached him on the path, a figure twice as tall as himself. Closer, he saw it was a little girl, half as tall as himself, carrying a long stick covered with tallow, the torch at its top casting around her a high black figure of shadows. So it's very threatening, even though it's a little girl celebrating, some national holiday.
But it's so almost cinematic. Suddenly I see it almost like the opening of a movie where here's this guy, we're getting to know his character, and this weird thing happens that might be foreshadowing something. I don't know, it's such an odd thing, this little girl with the torch.
And I think that really sets the tone for what I see as like the alternate story here.
Mm-hmm.
The story that's not about some guy named Thomas Lang. His publishers are waiting for his, grand finale book of his memoirs. I think it's about somebody being, kind of unmoored, alone and unmoored, and Berriault is a, great articulator of the befuddlement of loneliness, in a way, and I think that this guy epitomizes a lot of, what I see in others of her stories, which is like he thinks he knows what he's doing, but these other things are creeping up on him, and in his case, what his eyes see is not what's there, but what his eyes see are what the visions in his own head, which are starting to be frightening, and it happens a number of other times when we start to get to what he sees when he looks out into the mountains. And that's when the story kind of becomes this sort of a low-level, but not less intense for it, horror story.
Because right before that section that you're talking about, he talks about what he's lost. So it says, in quiet places he heard in memory the voices of his healers back in the States, men who had never truly known just what it was he had lost, and gave the loss such facile names, confidence, faith, whatever, and the names of several persons who had been dear to him and were lost to him. So there was all this promise and all this potential and all this confidence and faith. And I think the idea is that, as it says next, there was a loss beyond their probing, a loss they were unwilling to accept. It reminds me a little bit of what we've talked about before around this idea that these stories are so quiet and ostensibly, well, there's nothing happening. These people are in their own heads. Nothing's happening. When really, when I read a Berriault story, I feel like I ran a marathon. I mean, I feel like there's so much happening inside our minds. And she gives names and stories to things that are so difficult to articulate to another person.
And it's right here in that paragraph, in those sentences you quoted.
Mm-hmm.
It's that, the people back home, the healers, maybe his therapist, his friends, his editor, all saying, oh, Thomas, you're going to be fine. You got to get your confidence back. You got to get your mojo back. It's going to be fine. Why don't you travel? Why don't you, that'll help you,
Mm-hmm.
And so, he does because he can. But then Berriault says it, spells it out again in this way that she's almost frighteningly courageous to spell stuff out on the page, and somehow it doesn't, for me, weaken the story, because even when she spells out a theme, it makes it more complicated. Like here, there was no loss beyond their probing. A loss they were unwilling to accept as the finality he knew it was. A loss, a failing that might even be commonplace and yet was a terrible sacrilege. And then the kicker line, it was indifference, like a deep, drugged sleep to everyone else on earth. His problem goes deeper than his writer's block. He's become indifferent to other people, to life.
So can you read the next line?
It's always funny to read, like, it sounds ridiculous when you read it, but that is what's on the page. Comma. How could that change have come about in himself when his very reason for being had been the belief that each human life was sacred. There's on the back of my North Point edition, the Infinite Passing of Expectation, the first quote. I hate that word blurb, but that's what it is, the blurb. the quote is from Wright Morris, who's one of my favorite writers from Nebraska. He spent most of his adult life in California. He wrote about 40 books, most of which are not read anymore, but he's truly an essential American writer. And he worked at San Francisco State, where I taught for many years, and Gina Berriault taught also at San Francisco State. And, not the most kind of an unsung school, right, to have these two giants, but that's what happened. And it was an incredible department. And Wright Morris, there's a method to my whatever where I'm going here, I promise. But so Wright Morris says about Berriault, I'll just read what he says. Gina Berriault is at home with the emotions that do our living for us, enlarge and deflate us, nourish and exhaust us, and in the fullness of time, betray our extravagant expectations. That's a great quote, and you don't read quotes like that anymore. Wright Morris wasn't screwing around. He got right to the heart of it. And in the fullness of time, betray our extravagant expectations. This is another story about the passion of expectations and what can happen to them at some point in your life. But the reason I mentioned Wright Morris in this very long segue is that he is particularly great at questions in fiction. In other words, his prose often has questions in it, multiple questions, almost on every page sometimes. His characters will be asking a question, or his narrator will be asking a question, and this is an example of that in Berriault. How could that change have come about in himself when his very reason for being had been the belief that each human life was sacred? Instead of, she raises this question, how could somebody who believed that each human life was sacred, how could that belief go away? And presumably that's the belief that makes him a writer and makes him a human. That's gone away. And it doesn't answer it, it raises the question. And that is how I think she, and Wright Morris to an extent, gets away with kind of spelling out what may be the theme of the story, but instead of making it didactic, makes it complex. Because we don't know why he's now indifferent.
You know what the women in their beds, the Counterpoint Press line is?
Mm-hmm.
It is, how could that change have come about in himself when his very reason for writing had been the belief that all life was miraculous?
She changed it. She edited it.
And what do you think of that change, given everything you just said about Wright Morris?
I think you just hit upon to my mind, a truly fascinating edit. And I always wondered about that. I've always wondered about how, kind of gathering these stories in their originals, because I know she did editing, but there's no way to know, there's no biography of her, and there's not a lot of essays about her. So to me, the original is better.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see why I think she's trying to trick us in the revision to make it seem again that this is a story about writing. Because in my version, the original version, or one of the original versions, this was published in 1982. When did Women in Their Beds come out? 1998. So she revised going into those to that new edition of Women in Their Beds. So to me, mine is his very reason for being had been the belief that each human life was sacred. It goes to like the heart of who he is and not just his profession.
Yeah.
I think she's almost like, maybe she was self-conscious. She thought, oh, you know what, I gave away the store there in that line. I don't think she did.
Mm-hmm.
Again, because it's framed as a question.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's fascinating.
But I also feel like they're the same. They mean the same thing. They mean the same thing in that I think for a writer, the reason for writing is this belief that lives are sacred. People are complex. Everybody's kind of miraculous walking around. I don't know. I feel like, could it be that she was trying to mitigate the intensity of the first way of saying it, the way she said it first? I'm not sure. I guess we'll never know.
You're putting it more generously than I was. When I say tricky, I don't mean she's trying to trick us. I just mean that I think that the way that she rewrote it is more in line with what the character is thinking, which is probably a better way to go than what maybe the writer was thinking, his very being. And I think you're right. I think she, maybe it was too much. It was too charged. And so she edited it down. I mean, again, there's no way to know. I mean, it's obviously an incredibly key line in the story, and the fact that there are two different versions of it, I think, gives us some insight into the way she worked, and even revising a story that was written, maybe 16 years earlier, and then she makes a change like that. I think is really, really interesting.
The very next movement in the story is back to him opening the curtains and looking at those mountains.
Right.
And the hikers.
Which starts to bring us to what he starts to see when he looks out into the mountains at various points in the story. It's a common thing. You're on the ground and you're looking up at the people I remember being in Yosemite and looking at the people climbing, and they look like little ants, and that's kind of how they appear to Lang in this story. He's down on the ground watching them, and they start to take on, I think, kind of almost a sinister cast to him. When he's focusing on this movement in the mountains, which are people.
So there comes a description after that where he settles in like he's going to write in his notebook. And he's looking around and describing the other guests and the Persian rugs and everything around him. And then there's this line: he settled himself at a large table in a corner of the parlor. So we're like, okay, he's going to sit down and write. Look at all this stuff going on all around him. But all he could do was trace the glow and grain of the wood around his empty notebook.
Again, he's this writer who can't write. But if you're gonna write a writer that can't write story, then if you've got a detail where he's tracing the wood on the table, that's I'll take it because it's so damn great. But again, I kind of wonder. Okay, and somebody might listen to this, wonder like, well, okay, all right, well, where is this story going? Is it going anywhere?
Yes.
Is it? And it's hard to explain her compression. It's something you have to experience. But, it moves off of him sitting there trying to write again to kind of going back in his room, going outside, looking at the mountain. At one point, he sees some dogs, and in the faces of the dogs, he sees...
Yeah.
What'd you think of that?
I thought I have to ask Peter about this.
What does he see in the faces again?
He sees...
Who does he see?
It says, the dogs resembled wolves, tawny with black markings, and their wild, intelligent Mongol faces reminded him of the faces of the 19th century Russian writers. And then a little further down the list, Gogol, Tolstoy, Chekhov.
Right. In the wolves. This guy's kind of losing it. But, he sort of goes to his heroes, and he starts seeing his heroes in the faces of dogs. I mean, it's not exactly complimentary, but it's just weird. Like, it's this idea, and we were talking, I believe, before we started recording, about, what's that theory you mentioned?
Oh, the concept of defamiliarization.
Yes, what's that again?
So it's this Russian formalist literary concept about making extraordinary the ordinary, defamiliarizing something in your description, making it strange, as they say. So yeah, that
it's a pretty graphic example of that.
That
and
works.
Maybe even over the top, right? I mean, Berriault's not perfect, and not everything she does is brilliant, and that, even though I just thought it was more funny than I didn't see Chekhov. Although these are whiskered men, so I could see I think he's sort of Lang is almost telling a joke to himself, sort of, obviously, and so, but it wasn't like a part of the story that moved me. It was just sort of like, oh, that's odd.
Yeah.
But he's starting to slip. He's starting to slip, even more. And that actually is where the story starts to enter the final, what we would call maybe the final phase, right?
Yeah.
He keeps seeing these climbers, but he sees two climbers in particular at one point, and he starts to imagine what they're doing at various times of the day. They're up there. He imagines that they're a couple, which is important. He was once at this place with somebody he was a woman that he was with, who he no longer talks to. There's a beautiful line where he says that the people, the lover he was with, and the friend's wife, he's not in touch with any of them anymore, and they are most likely not in touch with each other. So you think of these very intense friendships and relationships and romantic relationships that we have, and then 12 years later no one's talking. Mm-hmm. How they would never have imagined that when they were all in the hotel together, probably. Is there going to be a time when none of us are going to be speaking?
I know. And there is a section right before all that where he's climbing up the stairs and he sees the photographs of climbers from before who had climbed the Der Eiger, this mountain, right. And it says that the names of the fallen were preceded by white crosses. So there's this idea about life and death there too. But what struck me even more than that dramatic detail is that he stops to look at a photo of a couple from Germany, a man and a woman. She a strongly smiling blonde, and he a curly-haired, handsome fellow, the kind who would take a woman along. What does that mean?
What does that even mean? But somehow we just sort of, I know that, right. I know
but that
guy.
Used to be him.
The guy was like, come on, we can do this together. Let's do it. And she's like, all right.
So,
or maybe, who knows, maybe she was a better climber than he was.
But I feel like he sees himself in that guy. Like, he calls him handsome. The blonde smiling, the curly-haired fellow is handsome and the kind who would take a woman along. And didn't he do that 12 years ago?
Sounds like it. I mean, except we don't know anything.
No, that's
about
true.
Her. Because I think the story is sort of depersonalized. This isn't the story of Thomas Lang's relationship in the mountains. I think of like something like Kawabata's Snow Country, where it's this incredibly torrid affair in the mountains, and then all the characters do is think about it for the rest of their lives. That's not what this story is. Mm. This isn't about Thomas Lang's personal life. Mm-mm. It's about these weird visions he's starting to have when he's trying to work on his memoirs.
You had doubts about it, but I still feel like there's something very clear. There's a very clear path from the beginning to the end. Every time I look at it again, I'm more and more convinced of that fact.
And I am won over by that. I read something once that Russell Banks said about a Eudora Welty story. He says you have to be 40 to read it, which is kind of ridiculous. And I think I was under 40 when I first read it. I was like, that's bullshit. I can do it. But I remembered that when I was reading this today. I was like, maybe you do have to be starting your life. You can see an end point. And you read this story, and that's what started to freak me out about this story. Mm-hmm. Not in a sort of a superficial, or not a it wasn't like hitting that. It wasn't like about dying. It was just about you reach a certain point, and you're the way you see those expectations that we talked about, last time, are starting to dim. And he's not at the very end of his life. That's what I think is so tragic about this story.
He's not.
Thomas Lang is not dying.
Maybe he knows he has fewer He has fewer years in front of him than behind him. And this thing about this age, leaning into 60, pushing 60, and the sense that this pressure that he has to write, maybe he feels that by this stage of his life, he needs to have written what, Gogol, Tolstoy, and Chekhov did in their lives. And when he looks at the faces of the dogs and sees his Russian writer heroes, she does write that he felt amused. It amused him, but then he felt lightheaded over it.
Because I continue to, and I may be absolutely wrong about this, but continue to believe that he doesn't know what story he's in, that he thinks it's a story about a guy who's trying to write his memoirs. And I think Berriault knows it's about a guy who's starting to edge away from life and the moment she's capturing that moment in the eerie visions he's starting to have. And that, to me, is where the story has its most power. And there's the line, and I'll read the paragraph, but here's where it happens, I think. The story, and this is where, when I was like, oh, wait, now I understand what Yvette was talking about. Why she was drawn to this story, when there's, many, many others that have, knocked me over quicker. This one took me a while. But here's the paragraph. Should I read it?
Yes.
In the morning, he went out under an overcast sky before any hikers appeared. The stone was monstrous. Each sight of it failed to diminish by repetition the shock of it. That's an amazing sentence. Each sight of it failed to diminish by repetition the shock of it. That double it. So steep was the north side, the mountain must have been split down the very center, and the other half was 100 miles away. The climbers were not yet halfway up the wall. Often, as before, he lost sight of them, found one again and not the other, and then found the other after losing the first. After a time, he covered his eyes to rest them. If they fell, would the silence and the distance deny to him their terror? He lowered his hand again, searched again, and found one dark figure on a snowy ledge. The figure fell the instant he found it. It fell so fast he was unable to trace its fall and unable to find it on a lower ledge or at the base. Nowhere, now, was the other climber. Then both had fallen, and their terror entered into his heart without his expecting it. It was the same terror that wakened him in the night at the last moment so that he might witness his own dying. It was the same kind of moment now, under the sun. With his hand over his heart, he went back over the hills to the hotel.
So this version, this edition says...
Oh, no, another change. Great. Oh, we're like making Berriault history here.
If they fell, would the silence and the distance deny to him the tragicness of their end?
So that I have, if they fell, would the silence and the distance deny to him their terror?
Yeah.
Huh.
And then
I'm going to go with my version.
I knew it. And then the last lines of the paragraph, then both had fallen, and their mortal terror struck at his heart. With his hand on his chest, he went back over the hills to the hotel. You had much more in your version.
Yeah, no, she's making significant edits on this story. And, think of what the scholars do with the Faulkner edits or whatever. I mean, this is a major, major American writer, what I would say messing with a story in a pretty significant way. But the upshot of this paragraph, I think my version is a little more subtle, slightly more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't notice it if I was only reading that version.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this version is a little less uncharacteristic of her to cook it up a little bit, and I feel like that's what I'm hearing there a little, but that's probably unfair. If what he saw with his own eyes just happened, right? And in my version, I feel that two people just died more than in your version, but I think in the revised version, he's right. He's writing it.
Yeah.
He's writing it, which is what writers do, because writers are cruel human beings that use the tragedy of others to make other people moved, but we're maybe not as moved by something that actually happens. I'm overstating that idea, but I think we can't underestimate at all that what just happened in both versions of the story is that Thomas Lang just watched mountain climbers fall off the face of a mountain to their deaths.
Yeah.
Is what he thinks has happened.
Yeah, I think Berriault writes about writers and journalists, people who keep diaries, but I think you're right. I don't think this is a story about writers for writers. I think you're absolutely right about that. And the idea of indifference that we talked about earlier, that's universal. Like, nobody wants that.
Right.
So.
But he is indifferent now, as we know. And even that, and I think in a way the story is about coming back from indifference, I think. I think it's an ultimately pretty optimistic story. He's starting to actually care again.
Yeah.
And he's starting to care so much that he's seeing people fall off mountains that may not have actually fallen off mountains.
Yeah.
Because the story is ambiguous at the end. The suggestion is that he's seen something that didn't actually happen.
Yeah. When he goes to inside the hotel and tries to convey to explain to somebody what he just saw, it doesn't translate, and then the ambiguity is there for us.
And there's that incredible line that the manager says. He's trying to tell the manager, the couple on Iger, they fell, and the manager says, "May I ask who?" "The couple on Iger," he says. And then the manager's confused, and they're speaking German, and his German's not very good. Yes, the photographs in the corridor. Only those who succeeded. Only those. He thinks he's talking about the people in the photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, no, I'm talking about these people who just fell off the mountain just now. And he says, the manager says, "There is no one climbing now." And then he says, "Then they fell?" And the manager says, "No one is climbing and no one is falling." Beautiful line of dialogue. Right? No one is climbing and no one is falling. And we don't know if that's true or not.
No one is climbing. No one is falling. No one is living a life to do such a thing. And no one is experiencing the worst thing that ever happened to them. Except
we know that in the world, and I think, not to cut to the ultimate chase of the book, but someone is always climbing and someone is always falling. And that's what he's seeing.
Mm-hmm.
The story is so broadly, thematically, it's crazy. But I think ultimately the story is really about is Thomas Lang starts to realize that everyone is climbing and everyone is falling, or many people in this given moment on the earth are climbing and falling right now. And he starts to care, or he starts to feel that again. And yes, he does start writing at the end.
Can you read the last paragraph?
Yeah, and I wondered, let me know if there's a change, because I'm so curious about this.
Okay.
Lang up the stairs, hand on the rail, a weakness in his legs from the terror of the lives lost, no matter if they were specks, motes, undulations of the atmosphere. Up in his room, he sat down at his desk, opened his notebook, and wrote the first word on the first of the faint lines that he likened now to infinitely fine blue veins. on the one hand, yes, this is now a triumphant writer story. He has come back to his notebook and he starts writing, but there's something about those blue veins that really is really striking, and that strikes me as being far more important than the memoirs. And how many times have you looked at lined paper and not seen that,
Oh, yeah.
And so Berriault, again, she shows us, like, look at what you're seeing. See it again, see it anew. And I mean, lots of writers exhort this. Emerson, everybody, people are always saying, try and make it new, see it new,
But it is true. I mean, you're making that point. And the only thing she changed was the very first line of that paragraph. Lang went up the stairs, hand on the rail, a weakness in his being from the lives lost, no matter if the climbers were only specks, etc. So there's a little bit of a revision there, of an edit there. But
no matter if the climbers were only specks, and I have no matter if they were specks, motes, undulation in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example of the danger of messing with a story. I'm a big fan, but this is, maybe you feel. I mean, I think we just got a little closer to her in a sense. Like, we see her struggling with this one.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I read these revisions. She's struggling with this story.
Well, any closing remarks on this story before we say goodbye to Gina Berriault?
This was a tough one, and it shouldn't be, but it really is.
You know what? And from my vantage point, I hear it as much more straightforward. I really do.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad because it's those two climbers, and even there's the one. I guess one thing I would mention is he, he's been watching these climbers, and there's this line about he wakes in the night wondering, and the way that Berriault puts it is he was wakened by a deep wondering about the couple on the ledge. The fact that they're lying on a ledge somewhere on that great stone stirred in him a concern for all the persons he had ever loved.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about this couple on the ledge makes him, again, without a lot of specificity,
Mm-hmm.
And then he went to sleep again, and the couple was lying somewhere on the cold vastness of the night. The couple was lying somewhere on the cold vastness of the night, on no ledge. So he has a vision of them falling even before they fall, and I think that's an important, just tiny little piece of the story is that what he's starting to see are the things he's imagining, but it's not necessarily real. And you could say that's a return to his imagination, and there's a positive spin on it, and also sort of that he's starting to enact the darkest visions of his imagination onto what he's seeing in the world.
Gina Berriault is the author of Works of the Imagination. It's published in The Infinite Passion of Expectation, published by North Point Press. It can also be found in the collection Women in Their Beds, published by Counterpoint Press, with an introduction by Peter Orner. Peter Orner is the author of 6 books, including Maggie Brown and Others and Am I Alone Here? He holds the professorship in English and Creative Writing at Dartmouth College. This has been The Lonely Voice on Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Our digital producer is Bree Kirkham. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.